Last week we began a new series on the concept of following God. And we introduced that concept and that whole sermon series with the question of who do you follow? And last week we kind of compared and contrasted the way that people follow one another in comparison to how we are to follow God. And I kind of used as the illustration last week this symbol or this letter or this means of communication, and you all learned last week that this means what? Twitter. So how many of you this past week did some tweeting because of the sermon last week? Anybody go out there and okay, we had one person who looked that up, but this is a way that people communicate one with another, where you tweet something that you want the world to know, whether it is very important, whether it is very small, and you have 140 characters or 140 letters in which to communicate that to all of your followers. And after last week, I want you to know that I've gone from 17 to about 29 followers, so thank you very much for asking to follow me. And so now there are twice as many people who will hear nothing from me because you are now following me, because I don't really tweet that much, but I've got a Twitter account because you have to have one to be an American citizen today, and so I've got one of those, but I don't do much tweeting or twittering. But what is interesting is that when you have this means of communication, in order to get the tweet, to get the communication, to get the 140 character letter from that individual, you have to be a follower. You have to follow someone. And it's pretty remarkable today that you can follow anybody that is out there. You can follow professional sports players. You can follow celebrities. You can follow just about anybody. And any time that they speak, that message will come to you because you are a follower, and you have to do nothing other than sign up the very first time. And that's the way that many people want to follow Jesus. They want to get his newsletter. They want to find out what he's doing. They want to have an easy one-time sign-up, but they really don't want to have to do anything with what God says to them. So they just want to kind of get the tweets so they can keep up and be inside, have the scoop on what's going on, and not really communicate and not really be involved other than getting a message from one direction to us. And we talked last week that whatever following Christ means, it does not mean that, because he tells us that if we're going to follow him, that if anyone would come after him, this was Luke 9 from last week, that a person must deny himself. There's no denying yourself in following somebody on Twitter. And that you not only must deny yourself or press yourself down or separate yourself from yourself and take up your cross every day, which is death, and to follow him. That's what we spent our time talking about last week, Luke chapter 9, 23, and how it is so easy for us to transcend or to transpose the concept of following God to the relationship with what it means to follow someone on Twitter. And so what we're going to do over the next several weeks is to begin to unpack scriptures that talk to us or that teach us about what does it really mean to follow God. How do we do that? What does it look like? And what is our response when we are called to follow him? Now, when we begin this journey, we're going to have to recognize that just about anything that we're going to look at, we're going to have our own view or our own way of looking at things. I don't know if this happens to you or not, but most of the time when I see something, I can see one thing, and my wife can see almost something else. Does that ever happen to you? I mean, you can be looking at just whatever it is, and you think it is blue, and they're going, no, it happens to be green, or any of those things that happen. Well, the same thing happens to us because we have our own bias when it comes to what does it mean to follow God. See, there are some people who say if you want to follow God, then you have to purchase this particular translation. And if you don't have this translation of the Bible, then however you want to follow him is okay, but you're not really following him because you don't have this particular translation. Well, that's not what the Scripture says, but that's something that we've kind of interposed in this to help us understand what it means to follow. For instance, when I was growing up, if you wanted to follow God, there were a couple of things that you were supposed to do. In fact, they were all listed for you on the offering envelope. Did you have a church that had an offering envelope that you check-marked everything on? Raise your hand if you remember those days. And that's what the commands of God were. And if you did those things, you were following God. Were you there Sunday morning? Check mark, right? Were you there on Sunday night? Check mark. Wednesday night? Yes. And if you were doing those three things, you were following God, right? Not to mention if you studied your lesson, right? You had that little check mark on there for your envelope. And then not only if you brought your Bible, somehow you got credit for bringing your Bible to church. I don't know why you did, but apparently if you did those things, and if you marked off all those things, invited somebody to those kind of things, then you were following God. And that, in fact, that growing up, that's what I thought meant that you follow God. You were there Sunday morning, you were there Sunday night, and you were there Wednesday night. And it was the evil people who were not back on Sunday nights, right? Those were the people that were not really spiritual. And then Wednesday night, that was the litmus test. If you were on church on Wednesday night, that meant that you were following God. You remember those days? And some of you still hold to those days, don't you? Right? I understand that. But I used to believe that until I looked at some of the people who were there on Sunday morning and Sunday night and Wednesday night, and these were some of the meanest, most depressed, angry, maniacal people I had ever seen. And I happened to see people that apparently did love Jesus that didn't show up on Wednesday nights, and that just kind of messed with my theology to have to kind of look at those things. Well, the truth is that we will typically identify and define following God by whatever we're doing. And if we're doing it, then that must be the way, maybe not the only way, but the primary and the most important valuable way is following God is the way that I do it, and everybody else needs to jump on the train so that they're following God as they're following who, typically? Me, right? That's typically the way that we do that. And you and I are smarter than to do that, but oftentimes we come back doing the same thing. In fact, we'll look at Scripture passages, and we'll only be able to see them in one way because we've interpreted the passage to mean this, and that's what it means to follow. If you've got your Bibles, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 4 today, because here's one particularly that if I am not careful, I can look at this command to follow, and I can identify it meaning one thing that rules me in bounds of following God as I'm supposed to, and rule out the majority of you as not following. This story in Matthew chapter 4 is actually found in 3 different places in the New Testament. Not only is it found in Matthew chapter 4, it's also recorded by Mark in chapter 1. And it has to do with the first calling of the disciples, the first calling really of the first 4. And it's very interesting when you look at these 3, because in Matthew 4 and Mark 1, the story is basically the same. But when you come to Luke chapter 5, Luke gives us a whole nother spin on that entire story, giving us greater detail that for whatever reason Matthew and Mark did not include, that actually changed to some degree the understanding of what actually happened here. So let's just take a look at Matthew chapter 4. If you get bored, you can flip over in Luke chapter 5 while I'm talking later on. But Matthew chapter 4, verse 18 says this: As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers. He saw Simon, called Peter, and his brother Andrew, and they were casting a net in the lake, for they were fishermen. All right, no breakthrough here, information here. These are guys. Jesus is walking by a Sea of Galilee. There's people fishing there because they're fishermen. Okay, great. That makes a lot of sense. Verse 19, Jesus walks up to them apparently and says, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." At once, or the King James Version says straightway, I love that word, straightway they left their nets and followed him. And that's the whole story. I mean, just in a few words, Peter was there with his brother Andrew. Jesus walking by the Sea of Galilee. They're casting a net in the lake because they're fishermen, and Jesus walks up and says, "Hey, follow me." And they go, "Okay." They leave everything and follow him. To prove it's not a fluke, going on further from there, he saw 2 other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, who would also be a son of Zebedee, right? Just a fun word to say, Zebedee. They were in a boat with their father, Zebedee. See, that's fun. Puts a little smile on your face. Just say the word Zebedee. Doesn't it, right? Zebedee. Preparing their nets, all right? So he's got Peter and Andrew, Simon and Andrew, whichever way you want to call them. He calls them, and they leave everything. They follow him. Then he goes along, and there's another couple of set of brothers. There's a James and a John. I had cousins, James and John, so it was always kind of fun growing up with them. They were in a boat, and their father there, Zebedee. They're preparing their nets, and Jesus called them, and immediately left their boat and their father and followed him. Those are really interesting passages, are they not? If you don't have the Lucan background to tell you a little bit more of the details of the story, it would appear that Jesus is just walking by, never having seen these guys, and say, hey guys, come follow me. And these guys just kind of like zombies going, yes, we will follow you. And they just kind of leave, and they just kind of walk on. They just follow without like turning their brains off. They're like, okay, follow, sure. They'll go, and they'll leave Dad there. I mean, come on. Fortunately, their mother wasn't there. They wouldn't be able to leave, right? But they could leave dear old Dad with some guy calling them. They just walk away. See you later, Dad. No big deal to them. Then they leave their nets. They leave their entire business. They go, and it seems kind of interesting, especially when you just look at what the Word says. Come and follow me, Jesus said, and I will make you fishers of men. And at once they left their nets, and they followed him. See, this is one of those passages that I can come and say, guess what? I've done this. This is what I have done, because I grew up in a little town in Arkansas, a little town called Malvern, and I felt God call me, so I left everything. I left my daddy in the boat there, is it like a bass boat there? It wasn't really like a boat here, but there on Lake Hamilton. I said, Dad, we'll see you later. The Lord is calling me, and so I went off to this intermediate state of Texas, and I got a seminary degree, and then I left from Texas, and then I went back to Missouri, and I was on church for a little while, did a pastoring thing, and then I left went to go to Oklahoma, and I'm just following God. Yes, Lord, whatever you tell me, whichever direction you want to go, I will go. And I've left cousins, and I've left moms and dads, and I would do everything, and I would follow. And finally here, getting close back to the promised land, just about 10, 12 miles from the border. And so maybe one day, if I continue to be good enough, the Lord will let me go back home to where he lives there in Arkansas. And so all those things, I can look at this passage and I can say, look, I did that. And this was what it means to follow God. It means to leave everything, leave home, leave grandma, leave cousins, and then you just follow and do whatever God says. But is that really what this is getting at? Is the calling for all of us to leave our jobs? And if God says, hey, leave your job, that you would just, okay, leave it, and then you would just follow him wherever you go? If that's the only thing it can possibly mean to follow God, then many of us, not me because I've done the right thing, but many of you out there must be living in rebellion to God because you have not left everything and followed him. Now, I know some of you have. I know some of you, and you can trace the way that God has moved your path throughout life and how he's done those kind of things. But the possibility could be when we look at a passage like this and following that maybe we are not supposed to all follow in exactly the same way. In fact, my following for God may be different in some ways than your following of God. Do you think that makes sense? Do you think that God went by all of the fishermen around Galilee and said, hey, I want all the fishermen to follow me? You think that's what he did? Probably not, because if he did, then there'd be nobody left to do what? Fish. And nobody would have anything to eat because there'd be nobody fishing. And so I've got a great theological, profound statement. Not all of our following must be the same when we're going to follow, because we're going to learn what it means to follow God. Not all of our following must be the same, but we all must be following. Isn't that pretty deep? That's pretty profound. I thought about 3 or 4 different ways, and I still don't like that one either. But the concept is that all of us must follow God, but the way in which we follow him may be different. But we're still following. And if you and I have a tendency to identify whether or not everybody's following by only one set standard, whatever translation that you're using or whatever color Bible, or I'm not going to pick on this one, but how you dress when you come to church, if there's only one kind of definition of what it must mean to be right to following him, then we might miss it, because I'm not sure that God requires all of us to do the same thing the exact same way. Friend, have you ever done something in your life and you want to leave so badly? I mean, you wanted to shake the dust of that little town off of your feet because God's called you to bigger and better, and he tells you to stay. And then your buddy that you literally like, or maybe you can't stand, I don't know what kind of buddy it is, God calls them to go do something different than you, and they get to go and do what you wanted them to do, and you never got to do that. See, sometimes God will ask us to stay when we want to go, and he'll ask us to go when we want to stay. And if we just line up with just one way that God is going to work, this is the only way that it could possibly happen, then we may miss out completely on what it means to follow. Because following God is not just getting in line with other people who are following God. That does not necessarily equate to following God. Do you hear me on that one? Following God doesn't mean that necessarily that you just get in the line of somebody else who's following God. It may mean that you have to follow God directly without following whatever that crowd, whatever that group, whatever that situation may be. In fact, we'll look at in a couple of weeks, maybe I think it's 3 weeks from now, where there is a conflict between one of the disciples and God and Jesus, and he says, well, what about him? How come he gets to do something different than I do? And Jesus talks to him and says, hey, you follow me. You worry about the other person. You let me worry about the other person. You don't worry about him. And isn't that true for us so many times? We're so worried about the other person, whether they're getting what God deserves, whatever they deserve from God, and we're so focused on them. Why is their life better? Why is their life worse? And what Jesus wants us to know is that he's asking us to follow a unique path just for us as long as we are following him. Let me see if I can kind of explain that in the passage. Looking back here in verse 19 and 20, it says, Jesus said, come follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And at once they left their nets and followed him. I think sometimes when we look at this passage, I think we put the emphasis in the wrong places. I think sometimes we look at the emphasis here of what they left. Because you really think about this. This is a person, a man, two men, who are leaving everything they know. That they're leaving their family. They are leaving their business. In fact, in these days, you learn the family's business. That's what you did. How many of you learned your family's business and are doing it now? How many of you learned your family's business and doing it now? 1. Okay. 2. That's not the way it used to be, was it? It used to be you learned the family business and you took over the family business. Today, it's not like that at all. Well, in these days, you took over the family business. So what does that mean? Not just for Simon and Andrew and not just for James and John, but what does that mean for their families if they leave to follow God? What does that mean for their family business? Unless there's other brothers, which we are not told about. Maybe there are, maybe they're not. I didn't do the research. But it may well mean the ending of that entire family's business. It surely means the separation of relationships for a period of time, and we will look at this passage and we'll go, oh, wow, look at what they left up. But you know what? I'm not sure that's where the emphasis really is in this passage. I don't think that's where we should put the weight of where this is. When we're looking at this, I think the weight ought to be, I will make you. See, sometimes we look at fishers of men, and we think, okay, the calling that God has for me is to be a fisher of men. Well, I don't know that there's a category of fisher of men in the grand scheme of the book. I think what Jesus is talking here is like, you guys are fishing for fish, I'm going to make you fishers of men, but I don't know that that's an official title that he gives people today. Ta-da, today, Jack Brown, you're going to be fisher of men. Ta-da, there you go. Get your little button, you get a little prize tag, you get your little parking place, you get all those kind of things. I'm not sure that's the way that it's saying it works. I know that God calls us to reach people, but I think this fishers of men is a play on the words, the fact that they were what? Fishing. And that they were fishermen. So I don't know that that's the emphasis. I think the emphasis, I will make you. It seems strange that a person could walk by and say, hey, come follow me, and people would leave everything and do that. It would seem strange, wouldn't it? I mean, I probably wouldn't do that. But imagine this. Imagine if a Warren Buffett, you know Warren Buffett, right? Rich guy, investment, that kind of stuff. Or a Bill Gates, kind of the computer guy, right? Or Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs' company, Apple, has more money, cash in hand, than like 2/3 of every world population. I mean, 2/3 of the countries in the world, Apple has more money than anybody else. It's amazing what it is. Imagine if one of those guys walked in and said, hey, would you like to intern with me and I'll teach you everything I know about my business? Would anybody stand up and follow? Anybody put your children out there? Hey, take this one, right? You know, been having trouble with him anyway. Take him, bring him back in 5 or 6 years and learn his ways, right? Well, see, in this day, the rabbis, those that were spiritual teachers, they had a lot of weight in the society. They had a lot of pull. They were people that were revered. They were looked up to. They were probably the most revered people of anyone walking around during those times. And Jesus, I think, qualifies as a rabbi. In fact, he gets called that other times by other people, rabbi. But in order to become a learner of a rabbi, you'd have to go through like elementary school. And I was reading about this, and somebody was telling me, they were telling me that 10-year-old boys, I don't know if I can believe this or not, but they were telling me that 10-year-old boys had memorized the Torah by the time they were 10. Do you know what the Torah is? The Torah is what? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and what? Deuteronomy. See, you had a hard time memorizing the names of those 5, weren't you? Somebody like, oh, supposedly 10-year-old boys would be able to memorize all 5 of those books. Now, I haven't been able to verify that, but I'm just hearing things that I trust, that they would have to read all 5 and memorize all 5 books before they got to finish the baby school. And then if they did really, really well then they would move to the next level where they would memorize the rest of the Old Testament. And then, if you finished all of those things, what you would do is you'd go looking for a rabbi that you could study under so that you could become a rabbi. And the rabbi would get to ask you questions to see if you were smart enough, to see if you were good enough. How many of you have been knocked out in the early rounds? How many of you right there? Yeah. Wouldn't even got to the semifinals. We'd have been out at the very beginning of that. And supposedly one person was teaching, and I cannot verify this, but they were teaching that in order to kind of test the student, that what the rabbi would do is the rabbi who's looking at this young person coming to want to study under him, he would ask him a question about a particular passage in one of the scriptures in all of the Old Testament. But he wouldn't give him the verse that he wanted to talk about. He would give him a verse, and he would give him one verse, and then he would have to answer a question based on either the verse in front or behind that verse. So not only did you have to know what the verse was, you had to know the verse in front and behind. And if you were a really good student, you would respond with an answer not from that verse, but on the verse that was in the front or behind of that one. And you went back and forth, and you started playing that game. I'm not answering this question, I'm answering the one above it. Well, I'm responding to your question above the one that you asked. And you played that 5 or 6 different times to determine whether or not this rabbi would take you on as one of his pupils. Can you imagine that? Why would you ever want to do that? Well, the position and the value of the rabbi was so much that that person wanted to become like the rabbi, wanted to become like that teacher, leader, and he would do anything to get that. Supposedly, when that person had passed all of that testing, know all the Torah, know all the Old Testament, be able to interact with the text above and the verse in front and the verse behind, all those kind of things, he would finally, the rabbi would look at that student, and in order to say, yes, you can become my student, he would say to him, what do you suppose? Follow me. Now, did he pick up these 2 boys out of rabbinic teaching school when he said, come follow me? Did he go get the best and the brightest of anybody that was out there? Did he get the SAT scores, the ACT scores, passed all those kind of things? No. Apparently, Jesus walked by and said, made this call to him, come follow me, and I will what? Make you into something more than what you are. I'm going to make you into something like I am. If you read the story in Luke, it gives us a little more background. Apparently the guys were not just fishing, they had just finished fishing and they were repairing their nets. And Jesus comes after they'd spent a hard, long night of fishing and gets on one of their boats and asks them to push out so he can begin to teach everybody. And he begins to teach them from the boat. And then he tells Peter and his brothers, hey, by the way, why don't you push out a little bit further and put your net on the other side of the boat? Do you remember that story at all, just vaguely? And they say, wait a minute, we're not going to catch any fish. We've just been fishing. We're the fishermen here. See, that's what it says in the passage. We're the fishermen, and you're going to tell us where to fish, but because it's you, Jesus, we'll do that. They flipped over their nets, and you remember what happened? Was there a couple of fish that got in there? Yeah. No, there were so many fish that they're about to sink a boat, and they called the other boat, which was James and John, and brought that other boat, and it took 2 boats to come in and bring the fish. And then Jesus says, why don't you guys follow me? And they look and they say, you got to be kidding me. This is the greatest success we've ever had in our life. We've never had this many fish. Is that what they said? No. They said, get away from us because we don't understand you. And you scare us. And Jesus said, no, you come follow me. And they left their nets and they followed him. See, it wasn't about just getting more fish. It wasn't about becoming fishers of men. I think it was a calling to become what God desired for them to be, and that he would make them into something and he would turn them. See, if we had a child that we could give away to give to Warren Buffett to turn him into the next Warren Buffett, we'd probably do it. In fact, we'd take it ourselves. Look, give us a try. We'll try. We would send a kid because we want them to become something more than what they can without us. And under that tutelage of a Warren Buffett, or the tutelage maybe of a Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, or any of those people, that these children or these people, we as adults, will turn into something more than what could possibly be without him. And that's what Jesus invites you to do. See, it's not about moving away from your home. I wish it was, because I'd get bonus points for that one, right? But it's not about that. It's not even about becoming fishers of men. I think it's a play on words. Is it literal? Yes, but I think it's a play on words. It means going and following him so that he will make you into what? Just a big you? No. That he might make you into something like him. That's the offer of when you follow. In fact, the rabbis, they would follow everywhere the rabbi went. The pupils, the disciples is what they were called. They would follow this rabbi everywhere to learn what the rabbi. In fact, there was a blessing, I am told, that you would speak upon the people who were trying to become like the rabbi. You would say to them, may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. May you be covered in the dust of your... What does that mean? That means that you're so close to him, you're learning so much, you're becoming more and more like him, that you're so close that when he walks, the dust, and you know what this is like right now, the dust flips up and it covers you. That is meaning that you're so close, you're beginning to look like him, and you're responding even to the dust from his feet covers you. That's what you are. That's what he's inviting us to. It's not to move your house. It's not to go across the country. It's not to make sacrifice. It's to become made into his image. So here I have to come to something very practical, because to me this is very philosophical and this is very theological, and I love those areas. But I've been trying to figure out how in the world can I convey what does it mean to really follow, and to know if you're following, and to get this being close enough so that the dust of your rabbi covers you. What does all of that mean? And I kind of thought about this. I had this idea on Monday. You see, on Monday, I was out at lunch with a Baptist dignitary, and we got to talking about important things, and he was saying, you know what, have you seen this building that I'm talking about? And I'm like, no, sir, I've not seen that building that you're talking about.